right, thanks very much. This is pretty exciting to do a presentation on fungi. It's what most of the time I'm talking about in front of groups. I am a former university professor. I'm an academic mycologist. I'm a former university professor, and I'm the founder and publisher and editor-in-chief of Fungi Magazine, which is has the largest circulation of any mycological journal in North America. So we talk about mushrooms and all other types of fungi in the magazine, and that's what I'm often interested in. And when I was a university professor, I taught a number of courses in microbiology and evolution, and evolutionary biology is what I've always been most interested in, especially symbioses, and fungi were sort of my model organism. And I just got roped more and more into mushrooms, and now I've written a number of books and things about mushrooms, and apparently some will be sent out to lucky winners. So on with the show. This discussion will be pretty fast-paced, a lot of pretty pictures about mushrooms and other fungi, some factoids, and then we'll get into kind of some interesting weird things that have happened with fungi concerning convergent evolution. So if you're not super into mushrooms or fungi, it doesn't matter. You'll see pretty pictures, and if you're interested in evolution, you'll know most of what I'm talking about already. So hopefully this will make sense. And this will just take like about 30 minutes. So a lot of the discussion will come from this. This is a shameless ad for one of my more recent books, The Lives of Fungi, which the publisher, Princeton University Press, sort of roped me into doing with this, I think, kind of an unfortunate subtitle, Natural History of Our Planet's Decomposers, because a lot of people assume that's what fungi do. And actually, the vast majority of fungi really are not saprotrophs, they're biotrophs, and therefore they're symbionts with other organisms or their pathogens, etc. So that's what the meat of the book is about. And again, there'll be some tales from this book throughout today's show. So we'll start off with this very famous quote from Theodosius Dobzhansky: "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." And when you walk through the forest or swim through water, see any sorts of living organisms, there's a lot of stuff that's kind of interesting. But if you dig a little deeper, a lot of times, a lot of the stuff doesn't make sense about what these organisms look like or how they function unless you know sort of their evolutionary history. And of course, people marveled at this forever. People studied fungi, people studied other organisms, and they got around to classifying them. For some reason, people have always been fascinated by classifying things. My kids, even when they're very small, like to order things, order books, order their toys, whatever, in some sort of order by size or who begat whom or whatever. And, biologists came to a bunch of strange conclusions that a lot of things didn't really make sense. For example, in looking at different types of fish, it's quickly realized that a number of fish like this one here have sort of a poor design about them, that they must come to the surface to breathe air. I mean, what kind of a designer would drop the ball and make fish that needed to breathe air? So this sort of thing puzzled people from day one. There's all sorts of different classifications and taxonomic schemes for ordering things, and to call all things that swim in water fish, there's actually nothing wrong with that. That's a perfectly good classification scheme. You could say everything that's terrestrial are terrestrials, and everything that flies are birds or whatever. There's lots of classification schemes that are different from the ones we scientists use to this day. There's a lot of indigenous people that classify things on whether they are useful to me, not useful to me, poisonous to me, edible, etc. And there's nothing wrong with that. Chinese people classify fruit based on whether it's heating fruit or cooling fruit. So those are taxonomic schemes or classification schemes that are useful to them, not really very useful to science. And more recently, of course, scientists have kind of figured out why some of the things in our classification scheme, like this type of a fish here, this whale, which of course is actually a mammal, do make sense. So, and what's this business with taxonomy and classification? Making sense of things, and if you're a biologist, you're making sense, sort of like phylogenetic or evolutionary sense of things. Here's what mycologists do when they're doing taxonomy. This is at probably a 4A or a BioBlitz or something like that. And you can see how much fun they're having nerding out over all these different mushrooms. A lot of them probably look pretty gross and disgusting, but these guys don't care. You got one guy from Virginia Tech on the left and another guy in the middle there. He's from the Field Museum, and they're puzzling over a number of different mushrooms and putting names on them. There's a person in the background there taking photos, and then there's the recorder on the computer. She's jotting down the names. And of course, the whole business of this is really not necessarily to classify things, but to know what we have in the environment and sort of get a handle on life and the species we have in an environment. But we really rely on taxonomy, of course, to be able to talk intelligently about what those organisms are. And again, the way evolution has worked sometimes has thrown some monkey wrenches in what we thought we knew about the evolutionary history of some of these fungi. Here's some other mycologists looking at fungi. This is at the Telluride Mushroom Festival, which is the largest wild mushroom festival in North America. On the right-hand side of the picture there, the guy sort of holding court, the Japanese-American David Hibbett, very famous mycologist, world-renowned. He has this big giant phylogenetic tree on the table there, this printed like family tree of fungi. And on the left-hand side are a bunch of people puzzling over this, and they're fascinated to see actual specimens of different mushrooms placed on the tree. And you can see there's groups of different mushrooms, some of which look quite similar, and it's easy to believe they're all closely related, come from a common ancestor. And then there's another group and another group and another group. Within any one of those groups, there's some oddballs that don't look anything like the others. And it's puzzling to see this based on what you can see from their form. Now, if you could learn other facts about them, the DNA sequence, the types of spores or habitat or some other things, you might say, oh, well, I get that these things are very closely related, but they just evolved different forms to match the habitat or situation, etc. But anyways, that's what's going on there. So he's probably telling them how convergent evolution led to some of these weird forms that don't seem to belong with one another, but now using more modern tools, we can kind of tease this out. We can make sense of things using modern tools. So back to this sort of overriding theme here. So I mentioned there's a number of different classification schemes. Scientists use a few different types. People have always had them. So if your classification scheme was things that swim in the water and they are fish, looking at living things and now extinct things, you would quickly come to the conclusion that these sorts of organisms here, all fish, of course, don't exactly fit in with one another, because you have the one fish on the right there that breathes air and has fur and is warm-blooded. The fish in the middle is reptilian, so it's cold-blooded. Most likely they're extinct now. And then the one on the right, that fish obviously has gills and swims around. They all have remarkably similar body forms. And so in studying evolution, you might actually come to the conclusion that, well, it's not evolutionary ancestry that leads to these forms. It's actually maybe something about the habitat. Maybe there's a best way to do fish-like stuff in the water, whether you're coming from a bird ancestry or a mammal ancestry or whatever. There's a best way to do it, and that niche, that habitat, that environment drives the form. And of course, that's exactly what scientists have found out. Scientists have found out that although things in that previous picture looked quite untidy and disorderly, getting to know how taxonomy works and how evolution works, you can kind of make some sense of that. This quote comes from a book that I used to use a lot as a professor, Dictionary of Microbial Taxonomy Usage. And there was a lot of other good, wise information in there that people had sort of come to the conclusion along the way of studying how evolution changes these forms. And so convergent evolution doesn't always tell you the story that you think you think you know at first glance, because of course these three fish here, you can see I've now put labels across the bottom. They're not actually fish. There's fish, reptiles, and mammals. And likewise, there's birds and mammals and insects and other organisms that fly. It doesn't mean that they all come from the same starting point, a common ancestor. The reason for the form, of course, is that, as I mentioned, the habitat drives the evolution of these forms. So if you look at the flippers or fins on these three different swimming organisms, they don't really come from the same starting point. They're a result of adaptation to habitat, and they're analogous. They're not coming from a common ancestor. So if you looked at a whole bunch of different mammals, their arms might all look different, but they all came from a common ancestor, and they've been sort of adapted to different forms for swinging or crawling or digging or what have you. These three organisms come from different starting points, and habitat shaped them to best swim through the water medium. And so those are called, of course, analogous features. Fungi have these sorts of things too, and I'll show you some pictures in just a second. Some other groups that are probably more familiar to you than fungi, because a lot of people, fungi are still kind of mysterious to them, but everyone knows plants, and especially cacti. Who hasn't gone to Lowe's or Home Depot and you're looking at nice little cacti to bring home? To be completely honest, most of the time the cacti, in quotes, that they're selling there aren't even cacti at all. They're probably euphorbs. So what's the difference? They both look pretty similar in this picture. Well, when we look at organisms across the globe, we see a lot of similar and, in fact, even closely related species in different parts of the planet. I study mushrooms, and especially mushrooms in the genus Amanita, and we have Amanita species like the Caesar Amanita or Amanita muscaria, that red Amanita with the white patches on top. We have those in North America, and you have other closely related species of Amanita in Europe. And the reason is because Amanita and a lot of other organisms evolved on the planet when all of the land masses were connected, and after they broke up, of course, isolation allowed for speciation in the different regions. However, they come from the same starting point. Therefore, you have a lot of Amanitas that look pretty similar to one another, both in North America and Europe. With the cacti, that's not the case. Cacti are much more recently evolved. Cacti didn't evolve onto the planet. They didn't arrive until after the breakup of Gondwanaland. So cacti are New World only. We only have cacti as native organisms in the Americas. They're not anywhere else. There are other organisms that look a lot like them, like these euphorbs here, and they're from the Old World. It's incredible how similar the morphology of these organisms are in the number of different species. Again, here's cacti and euphorbs. Here's more cacti and euphorbs, and remarkably similar. One thing to note about when you go to the Home Depot and look at these so-called cacti, take a look at the spines on them. Are they in pairs, as in this case here? If they're pairs, those are euphorbs. Those are not actually true cacti. True cacti have their spines in clusters, like that guy on the right there, and the guy on the left there has true cacti thorns, so they're in clusters. And how about this one here? I have one of these, this Euphorbia obesa, the baseball cactus. Again, it's not a cactus, it's a euphorb, but it looks an awful lot like a cactus. If you could see what its spines look like, that they're very, very rudimentary little things in pairs, unlike the similar looking true cactus on the left, which has clusters of spines in groups. The flowers are the same way. The flowers of true cacti have many, many petals and lots of stamens. The euphorbs have a very, very different flower. If you can think of crown of thorns, that's a euphorb flower. Very different. And just as there's different plants that mimic one another, there's all sorts of other organisms that mimic plants. There's a lot of different insects and other creatures that look like plants for camouflage or for whatever reason. Likewise, there's all sorts of organisms that mimic fungi too. This is, again, at the Telluride Mushroom Festival, where people go crazy for all things having to do with mushrooms. They dress up in mushroom costumes, and there's a big parade, etc. But there's a lot of other forms of life on the planet that have evolved similar looking forms to fungi. Up in the top left there, this is an oomycete, Phytophthora infestans. This is the cause of late blight disease of potato and caused the Irish potato famine, which is one of the greatest disasters in human history. It changed the face of the planet. It put a so-called put a Irish cop on every street corner in Boston and wiped out a large portion of the population due to starvation and famine in Ireland as well as other parts of Europe. And this was in the mid-1800s that this fungus, in quotes, it's not really a fungus, Phytophthora, actually more closely related to algae. But it has a very much fungus-like body morph. It looks like it grows like a mycelium, like fungi, and it attacks plants like a lot of other plant pathogens. The one in the bottom right corner is a so-called slime mold. Again, it's not a mold or a fungus at all. It's a slime mold, and they've long been studied as fungi because they kind of grow in some cases like fungi, but they're not. They're actually protozoans and most closely related to amoeba. So these are organisms that just so happen to grow like a fungus grows. And the reason is because where they're doing what they're doing, the best way to do that is apparently to ooze around or grow kind of in a mold-like fashion and then grow into things, digest their media, and et cetera, make spores, much like a fungus does. Here's a plant that even grows much like a fungus. This is dodder. This is a kind of a problematic plant pathogen that attacks other plants. Looks very much like a mold or a big mass of fungal hyphae on top of a plant. It's a big problem down in the south. So if you're dialing in from Florida or the deep south, you've probably seen this. It's common in the Mediterranean and other parts of the world. There's quite a few species of dodder. The genus is Cuscuta. Anyways, besides looking like a fungal mycelium, and not really very dark green ever and photosynthetic looking. They're mostly kind of yellow green, or some of them are even orange colored. Besides having a body morph like a fungus, the way it attacks plants is very similar to plant pathogenic fungi. It produces a kind of a haustorium, a peg that punches through the outer cuticle of a plant and sticks its absorptive tissues into the plant cells. And this haustorium of this plant looks remarkably like plant pathogenic fungal haustoria. It's really amazing how convergent evolution has driven all sorts of forms of organisms to look like one another. There's even animals that look like mushrooms. This is Dendrogramma. This is a type of, it's sort of like a jellyfish relative. I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy before. It's kind of an obscure organism. It was just discovered a few years ago. It's sessile, so it lives on the bottom of parts of the ocean, but otherwise looks very much like a mushroom, doesn't it? Has sort of a cap and a stalk, and even has sort of gills underneath the cap, which function much like gills do. The gills on a mushroom, of course, are where spores are produced and blasted off from, but they also support the cap and hold it up, much like the ribs of an umbrella, and much like these so-called gastrovascular branches here of Dendrogramma. So there's a lot of organisms imitating other organisms out there. It's just evolution gone crazy. Okay, so what is exactly a fungus? I've shown you a lot of things that look like fungi. How would I know the difference? So here, in a nutshell, here's a couple slides on basics of fungi in case you don't really much know. Oftentimes in classroom situations, both in high school as well as in sort of general biology classrooms at university, fungi often, at least until recently, have been kind of glossed over as being sort of obscure group of organisms that aren't really very important, and you end up spending more time on animals and plants. And it's kind of a shame because the fungi really truly are some of the puppet masters of the planet. They control a lot of life in most, if not all, biomes on the planet. Maybe not so much in aquatic situations, but for sure terrestrial situations. Okay, so here's some fungal basics. So fungi are eukaryotes, like us, which means, first of all, they're not prokaryotes like bacteria. Prokaryotes have a very simple cell whereby there's no membrane-bound organelles, there's no nucleus or ribosomes or anything like that. It's a very simple cell with a single chromosome in it. All of the more higher forms of life, eukaryotes, of course, have membrane-bound organelles like a nucleus, ribosomes, these sorts of things, and often cell walls. So they're quite similar to us in that respect. How you would know fungi from plants and animals in these kingdoms of eukaryotes is plants have a cell wall that's made of cellulose primarily, and fungi have a cell wall made primarily of chitin, and animal cells, of course, do not have a cell wall. So you could, assuming you had a microscope, you could quickly discern amongst those different kingdoms of life. Fungi are the kingdom of fungi are most closely related to animals. Our two kingdoms share a common ancestor, so we're most closely related. Both animals and fungi are heterotrophs, which means we, of course, don't synthesize our own food and energy like plants do. Fungi and animals, both being heterotrophs, they have to eat other living creatures or eat other things that once were alive. Fungi are extremely diverse. They inhabit all biomes of the planet. And of course, it's easy to imagine fungi being sort of right out the window where I'm sitting in the Midwest, because it's usually moist here and a pleasant temperature. But you would assume there's probably no fungi in deserts, Antarctica, beaches, these sorts of places. But believe it or not, fungi actually dominate these most difficult places to live. In Antarctica, beaches, deserts, there's not very many organisms, but believe it or not, fungi actually are some of the dominant organisms in these habitats. You may not see them very often or ever because they may be buried or they may be growing within tissues of other things or down in the soil, but they're, believe me, rest assured they are there. And the other thing about fungi is having not really been studied so much until fairly recently, they're poorly unknown and most are not yet described. So of the 100,000 to maybe 150,000 species of fungi we have names for, we know there's a lot more. That's probably maybe 10%, maybe only 5%, maybe only 1% of all the fungi out there. And that's based on finding DNA in the soil all over the planet and in the water. And you can look at the DNA sequence of this DNA and determine that it's fungal. We can determine it's not a fungus we know, and it's probably a fungus we may never really know much about because it probably can't be cultured, and therefore we can't really visualize it because a lot of these microbes are quite small. So one other thing to point out about some fungi basics, I mentioned that they are biotrophic, mostly not rotters and decomposers. And of the biotrophic fungi, most of them probably are parasites, believe it or not. So most fungi seem to be symbionts. That means that they live as a partner. Their lives are intertwined with a partner, with a host. They can be parasites. Symbionts are parasites, but symbionts can also be mutualistic. They can mutualistically benefit one another. I usually like to point that out because the word symbiont is often erroneously used to mean sort of mutualistically beneficial when that doesn't have to be the case. Okay, so let's go forward and see a few pictures of fungi that probably would make sense to people and maybe some that you would be surprised to know it's a fungus. So a lot of people's idea of a fungus, if they have any idea at all, is something like this. It's a white button mushroom that's cultivated, and you might find it on the jar, in a jar on the shelf at your grocery store or on food. But it has a wild relative, and that's this fungus growing in the wild. They grow in grassy areas. So this is Agaricus campestris, or a closely related species. And how do we know, about this organism? How do we have this name for it, Agaricus campestris, etc.? So this came about pretty recently, just in the 1800s, when scientists really started to start up the field of evolutionary biology. A couple big breakthroughs came in the field of evolutionary biology. One was recognizing that natural selection was a driver of evolution, and this came from Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, pretty much at the same time, looking at organisms in islands. Wallace in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia, and Darwin as he was traveling around South America looking at islands there. And then the other big breakthrough, at least in my opinion, came when Linnaeus came up with this improved system for naming things, the binomial nomenclature, which involves Latinizing scientific names of organisms, even Latinized his own name. Carl von Linné became Carolus Linnaeus, and it really simplified and made sense of putting names on organisms. So that Agaricus bisporus I mentioned, this meadow mushroom that can be cultivated and put into jars and put on the food, this is what probably it would have been called back in the day, and keeping in mind that with the older system of naming organisms and living creatures, you could have an organism called one thing in one town and travel a little distance over the mountains or to the next valley. It could be called something else entirely. So, I mean, imagine trying to do science if that was your convention. This organism would have been called probably back in the day something like Fungus campestris albus supernae inferior rubens, which describes this organism. It's a fungus, and it grows in grassy areas. Fungus campestris albus supernae means it's white on top, and inferior rubens means it's red on the bottom. That's okay, but there's lots and lots of other species, trust me, that match that description. So that name doesn't really work really well. When Linnaeus came along, he came up with binomial nomenclature, relies on, kingdom, phylum, class, order, this hierarchy of naming, and then you get to a scientific name with a binomial, Agaricus campestris. If I tell you Agaricus campestris, and assuming you know about fungi, you know Agaricus, so now in your mind's eye, you know all of the different things that makes up all of the species that would be lumped into Agaricus. And then when I tell you campestris, that specific epithet on Agaricus campestris tells you one and one species only, and you can go to the original description and find out all of the the features of this organism. Likewise, this little guy here, this is the earpick mushroom. It's a pretty common little tiny thing that rots conifer cones all across North America and Europe. It's most common in the Pacific Northwest. Back in the day, it would have had this word salad of a name across the bottom here, Erinaceus parvis, etc., etc. But now we call this Arascalpium vulgare. Makes it a lot more easy to discuss science and scientific names and organisms with other scientists when you have a binomial name like this. So this is Arascalpium, the ear pick, because it looks like an ancient tool that used to clean out people's ears in Victorian times, and vulgare because this is the most common species of that genus. Vulgar means common. So Arascalpium vulgare. But now here comes the hard part. So you want to identify something or name something. You don't just look at some of the features, the macroscopic and the microscopic features, but you look at habitat, season, literature, geography, a whole bunch of things that go into this. The trouble is, evolutionary forces can throw a monkey wrench, as I mentioned in the outset, and make things tricky. So here's where it kind of gets fun. It gets fun with this quote by Charles Darwin that he said, evolution has led to endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful. And again, studying mushrooms, this is really easy for me to make a statement like that because I find mushrooms to be extremely pretty. Of course, Darwin didn't know a whole lot about convergent evolution at the time. We now do. And so things that frustrated evolutionary biologists for quite a long time now are maybe less frustrating and a little bit more exciting, frankly, to kind of try to figure out what's going on. When it comes to mushrooms, and mushrooms are sort of the fruit body of the fungus, they're the structure that has to do with the sexual reproduction of the organism. It's sort of like flowers on flowering plants. When it comes time to make these, they come in a number of different forms, but for the most part, these. You have an agaric form on the left, upper left, that has a cap and a stalk and gills. You'll have a bolete form, which has a cap and a stalk. And instead of gills underneath the cap, you have tubes or pores that the spores come out of. And then there's also the polypore form down on the bottom left, which is a shelf-like thing that has tubes or pores that the spores come out of. There can be truffle forms and coral forms and toothed forms, like you see here, and other forms as well. But the three on the left, those are the main three kinds. And just because one group has agaric forms doesn't mean they all have to have agaric forms. These forms have evolved numerous times, actually, because turns out there's probably only so many ways to make a mushroom. So this is what's been kind of confounding to people over the years. So back to this guy here. This is Agaricus, and it really is an agaric form, as a cap and a stalk and gills underneath where the spores come out. And you'd think at quick glance, it's probably most closely related to these guys here. This is Russula on the left, Lactarius on the right. They're both in very close relatives. They're in the family Russulaceae, and although they look very similar to that previous mushroom, they're actually not that closely related. It turns out this form has evolved more than one time. And in fact, within the Russula ancestors, the Russulales, the order of Russula, that also includes Lactarius, you have all kinds of things. You have truffle-like forms there on the left. You have polypore things like that on the bottom right, toothed mushrooms, coral mushrooms. You have all these different forms. So what's going on here? People placed them in all different groups a long time ago based on the best taxonomy knowledge they had at the time. But it turns out evolution, and more correctly, convergent evolution, has driven all of these different forms because it turns out the polypore form, well, to do what polypores do, rot wood and come out the side of a tree, it's best to have a mushroom that looks like that, apparently. If you're moving into dry and deserty areas, it's best to have something that stays underground, like this sort of truffle-looking thing. So again, we come back to where we started with the fish and the reptile and the mammal. A couple more examples of sort of evolution out of control with mushrooms. We have all kinds of different little club-shaped things. Some are ascomycetes and some are basidiomycetes. These are two different classes separated by 450 million years of evolution. So they're not closely related at all, yet they have very, very similar looking forms. And so I see like about 1 minute left, and I can show you maybe a couple more things. Truffles. Everybody probably knows about truffles, probably have dreamed of trying a truffle one time or another because they're supposed to be the pinnacle of gastronomic excitement. Well, it turns out there's all kinds of different truffles. There's culinary truffles, and there's other types of truffles that are really not edible at all. And again, this is a Russula relative here. You can even see a little nubbin of a stalk on this truffle because this guy has been It started out as a mushroom millions of years ago, and it's moved into these dry habitats, kind of on mountaintops. So it's best not to be out in the open where it would dry out. It's best to keep its fruit body kind of underground, tucked away, and still hasn't turned entirely into a truffle. It's still got a little bit of a stalk there. These are boletes that do the same thing. They're basically a truffle form of a bolete mushroom. And just to finish up here, what's going on here? Why would things want to go from a perfectly exciting, pretty looking mushroom or bolete to a truffle looking organism? If you look at things about where truffles are found, and this is a species count of truffle species in Europe and in North America and Australia, you could quickly note that there's some things about the habitats of these three different regions. North America has a lot more desert and beach areas than does Europe, and Australia has even more than North America. In fact, most of Australia is quite dry and arid. And sure enough, the dominant types of mushrooms we see in Australia turns out to be truffle forms. They're still getting discovered all the time because no one has really looked so much into mushrooms whatsoever in Australia until very, very recently. I think that might be my last slide. Oh, I just have a couple more on different mushroom forms. Here's an agaricus related to that Agaricus campestris I showed you. This is a beach growing agaricus, so you can see the sand there, and it's give it a few more million years and come back, and it'll be a truffle completely underground. It barely pops up above ground now. We have a number of other mushrooms that sort of form these truffles with stalks. Again, in desert areas, this is from Griffith Park in Los Angeles. This is from dune areas near where I live in Chicago. This is another type of a tulistoma, one of these stalked truffles from a beach dune area. And that just shows the progression of evolution from an agaric form on the left through a sequestrate form, and then given much more time, species become much more truffle-like in these arid habitats. And I think that's, whoops, that was my last slide. So we can stop there, and hopefully I didn't go too much over my time limit. So thanks for being patient with me.
All right, Britt, thank you. That was perfect. The best part about that was how much it complements what PIES, the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science, is all about. My name is Kenny Coogan. I'm the education coordinator for the Center for Inquiry, which includes 3 programs for K through 12 teachers. And Britt just did a wonderful webinar for PIES, the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science. And Britt, as you were doing your presentation, I was pulling things from our internet because 2 years ago we had an entire webinar about slime and slime molds and mucus. And if you can't hook kids with mucus, then you're out of luck.
I remember when that book came out.
All of our past webinars are on our YouTube page. And this screenshot's from a while ago, but we have lots of videos, and this very presentation will be on our YouTube page by tomorrow. We have a very active Facebook page as well as a website, which is tieseducation.org. If you go to our website or to our Facebook page, you'll see all of our upcoming webinars. We have a webinar 1 week from today on teaching climate change, what teachers want to know. The director of TIES, Bertha Vasquez, her and a couple of colleagues wrote this, and it's going to be published very soon. Later this month, we have a really cool program. Well, we have 2 presenters on chimpanzee research. And if you know undergraduate students, they can go and do that field work in Uganda. And then they can also do some primate studies in Costa Rica. And I participated in that maybe 18 years ago when I was an undergrad in Costa Rica, and it was wonderful. And then we have lots of other stuff coming up in the school year. If you go to tieseducation.org, you'll see all of our teacher resources, and TIES and Center for Inquiry, all of our programs are free. We have full curriculum, we have lessons, we have labs, we have activities, we have videos. Everything's free. Something else that Britt mentioned was about phylogeny. And here's a screenshot that I just took of a online program that we promote from PBS Nova. And this is where the kids have to make a phylogenetic tree. We do have K through 12 programs. Most of our lessons are for middle schoolers. And this is an excellent middle school activity because if you're a middle school teacher, you may know where they want to put this mushroom. Are they going to put it on the palm tree branch or the animal branch? We have all of our stuff is free except for one thing, and that's our book. And that is because we have to print the book and it costs money to print the book. But if you can't afford the book, which currently is BOGO, buy one, get one free, you can still access all of the labs and lessons and activities for free on our website. So we have an entire tab about our book. So you're not missing out on anything. But like I mentioned, if you buy one of our books, you can get another one for free. You can donate it to a library. You can give it to one of your teacher friends. Another program that we have is Science Saves, and our mission is to generate an appreciation for science. We want to promote that it is okay for scientists to change their ideas and theories based on research, because we wouldn't want somebody to dig their heels into something even after learning it was wrong, because that's what science is. We're moving to the different pieces of evidence. Guys is all about science, and it meets or exceeds all of the science standards in all 50 states, whereas Science Saves has free lessons for all the curriculum. So we have language arts, math, history, science. We want to promote a National Science Appreciation Day on March 26th, which many years ago we came up with the polio vaccine. And if you go to our website, sciencesaves.org, you can see if your state is celebrating National Science Appreciation Day. I think we're right under 20 states right now. And if your state is not celebrating, you can sign a petition that goes to your governor. We have free lessons about pseudoscience. And every year for the past 4 or 5 years now, we have given away $15,000 to graduating seniors for creating a 30 to 60-second video on how science has improved their lives. So right now it's February. The deadline is the first week of May, right there. It's going to be, I think, May 7th, 2025. And so some students have submitted a 30-second video about how their sister took Tylenol and didn't have an allergic reaction. And that person won $10,000 to use for their undergrad. We had other people talk about fake limbs, and we had other people design like fake skin. So it could be as basic as Tylenol or as complex as prosthetics. Our third program is Generation Skeptics, and we would like to promote that we need to have critical thinkers for a healthy population, and we should not be believing everything we believe. There's lots of misconceptions out there, and all of our resources are free. All right, and with that, Princeton University Press was kind enough to donate some books, and the winners are Rebecca C., Amber R., and Ashley A., and we will be sending you those books probably tomorrow. Thank you, Britt, for that commercial. All right, Britt, we have a couple of questions coming in, and I'm going to read them for people watching them on YouTube. Ashley asks, is there ever a case where an organism and a fungus that it mimics, or vice versa, are more closely related to one another than they are related to an organism in their own kingdom? Maybe not kingdom, but maybe phylum. With the convergent evolution, is there ever a case where they accidentally evolved to look more similar than something that they're
okay, so
actually
read the question again, because I'm not entirely sure I understand it.
Is it possible for two organisms in different kingdoms to be more related to each other than in their own kingdom? And the answer is no, because that's why
Right.
scientists put them in that.
Yep. So, so when we're looking at the fungus in quotes, the oomycete fungus, Phytophthora infestans that cause the late blight disease. Um, it looks much more like a lot of fungi than a lot of fungi look to other fungi. However, when you look under the hood, it reacts to uh, poisonous compounds differently. It doesn't do some of the things that fungi did, and that tipped people off. That although it looked, I mean, it was classified with oomycetes and other things that were fungi, but it tipped people off that this fungus doesn't seem to act like a fungus. And then when you look under the microscope, there's some things about it that are actually different that you wouldn't have seen in the days before a microscope. And then likewise, looking at DNA sequence analysis, of course, it looks, nothing at all like a fungus. It just happens to look like it. But yeah, so you can have different groups. If we're talking about fungi, you could have different groups of fungi in, say, different classes or different orders of fungi look more like others from other orders or classes than to ones of themselves, but not outside of fungi because they're not that closely related if they're not within that kingdom. So that's how that goes.
Amber asks or says, I thought most fungi are saprophytic. So,
Right.
Britt, can you tell us what saprophytic means?
Yes, definitely. And I purposely, probably every discussion of fungi that I ever do, purposely put that slide up there that says most fungi really are not rotters. They're not saprophytic. And the reason I do that is because we all were learned that. We're all taught that in school that, there's fungi are kind of a small, obscure group of organisms, not entirely important. They rot stuff and build up soils and things like, and that's kind of nice. And if it wasn't for fungi, we would be buried under all this dead and dying plant material. So that's kind of nice. But otherwise, we don't really need to worry too much about fungi. Turns out the majority of fungi don't actually live saprobically. And also, I would want to point out, I wouldn't use the word saprophytic because that implies plant. The phyte part on there implies plant. And so I'm very careful never to say saprophytic when I'm talking about non-plants. And the reason is because a long time ago, when I think I was either a doctoral student or a young PhD scientist, I had submitted a paper. I had submitted a paper and the editors basically zapped me on that word and just like went on and on about how that was very poor scientific verbiage. And so I learned they were right. And so I learned to not do that. But anyways, so the majority of fungi actually seem to be biotrophic, not saprotrophic. And they live as either mutualists where they benefit their host, like mycorrhizal fungi or something like that, or they're a pathogen. So
All right, well,
that's that.
that's a perfect segue because we have presented PIES, Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science, in all 50 states at all 50 state science conferences. And depending on what state you are in or what country you are in, you mentioned this, some scientists use the word symbiosis or symbiotic relationships, and they mean mutualism. And
Yeah.
then some other states really mean, uh, commensalism or parasitism or like some other type of relationship. So Ashley says or asks, are there any examples of fungi having commensalistic relationships with other organisms? And then some scientists don't even believe in real commensalism.
Yeah, it's a very fine line. So um and and it's not just where you're from, how the term is used. It seems like in regular, like non-scientific media, newspapers, things like that, sports, the word symbiosis is like overused. And more than often, it's used to mean mutualism when that's not what the definition of the word is. Organisms that their lives are closely intertwined, like a host and a pathogen or something like that, those are symbionts. COVID-19 clearly is not good for humans, but it is a symbiont of a human. It's I wouldn't say life because it's a virus, but it's closely tied to having a human host. So those are symbionts of one another. So are fungi commensals? Yeah, of course. Lots and lots are, and I think your quick rejoinder there about whether or not there truly really are commensals, because you could look everywhere and find situations where organisms kind of in passing seem to do something and interact with one another, but that doesn't mean that they're intertwined in any real way. But in any case, a lot of commensals, I might argue, are a lot of epiphytic fungi. So living on the surface of everywhere outside, all sorts of other plants, are all kinds of other molds and other fungi that, yeah, you know what, maybe they benefit the organism some of the time, maybe by getting in the way of pathogens and taking up that space. But for the most part, they're existing there. The host that they're living on probably doesn't know that they're there, probably doesn't care. The fungus itself is benefiting because that's where it needs to be and it's growing there, but maybe its host doesn't get much. But yeah, commensalism, I've always had a tough time with that because I mean, you could say that about anything. Dead leaves falling off of a tree, are those benefiting the host by rotting? I mean, these are areas where they become more philosophical than biological discussions.
Well, I want to just say it again that your presentation was so great, definitely for middle schoolers and it would be also beneficial for high schoolers because the way that you use terms and you refer to things is like right from the curriculum. And we do encourage teachers to play or assign parts of our webinars or sections of our webinars to their students. And in the near future, we'll have some questions that you can assign your students that go with certain webinars. So, Britt, the last question we have for you is for maybe students who are in like a senior or are about to enter undergrad and they have an interest in fungi, mushrooms, how can they get experience when they need experience in order to get in a lab?
Yeah, that's a real good question. I get asked all the time, if I'm at a botany fair or a fungal fair or something like that, or just at a lecture, I get asked all the time by students or sometimes the parents of students, if the student's too shy, how to pursue studying fungi in college, and likewise undergrads wanting to take the next step. How do I become a mycologist and study and get graduate degrees or a degree or whatever in mycology? And so, well, the first answer is there are no real programs in mycology. There's no degree in mycology. So I have a degree in plant pathology. I studied as a doctoral student fungal diseases of plants, but as a master's student, I studied plant biochemistry and learned about endophytic fungi that live inside of plants but create sort of plant-like hormones to sort of direct the life and benefit the plant that's their host. But as an undergrad, I studied, believe it or not, insects and got into fungi because I started looking at the symbioses of insects that have co-evolved with mushrooms. So I sort of came to it from a different area. Back in those days, there weren't a lot of people studying fungi, so you almost had to go to one of the big land-grant schools that studied agriculture to study fungi. And again, it was about either medical mycology, looking at diseases of humans, or you were studying diseases of crop plants. Now things have gotten a little different because fungi have become pretty cool all of a sudden. So a lot of schools, whether or not they have a mycologist, the person that does the microbiology probably is kind of into mushrooms and other fungi. So it's actually pretty easy to find a program where to study. But for more discussion, I always encourage people just to send me an email and we can talk. My email address is fungimag@gmail.com because I publish a magazine called Fungi Magazine. You can just Google my name. Nobody has a name like mine in the new world. So you can find me. I'm all over the internet and very easy to find. But I also have long been into, I'm not a university professor anymore, but I've long been into and involved with education of students and interested in students learning about fungi and sort of like to evangelize about it. I've been the director of the Telluride Mushroom Festival for over a decade, and we have a student scholarship there that pays students interested in fungi to come to the festival, pays all of their expenses, travel expenses, everything. And you can be any level of student, high school, college, graduate student, whatever. Most of the recipients are international students, so it's quite a good deal for them because it pays their airfare and everything. But of course, North Americans can apply as well. But yeah, anyone wanting to ask me questions about how to get involved, just send me an email. I'm on lots of committees with both academic as well as sort of amateur mycological societies, and so I pretty much know all the academic mycologists in North America. There's not that many, and I know most of them. So if someone has an idea of where they want to go to school geographically, I can put you in touch with someone who you might want to study under. And it's a great time to do mycology. It's gotten really exciting all of a sudden, people making different materials and looking into sustainability and everything.
How is cordyceps research going these days? Is it more popular than ever?
Oh my gosh, so popular. So when I was an undergrad, there was like one species of cordyceps all over the world, one species of cordyceps, two, Cordyceps militaris and Cordyceps sinensis. Now, what we call sort of Cordyceps, sensu lato, like cordyceps and cordyceps-like fungi and their allies and their relatives. Now there's not only more than two species, I forget how many families of cordyceps and hundreds of species. And so, of course, a lot of these are being looked into for various antimicrobial and other pharmaceutical properties, as well as some other things, because things like cordycepin, sort of a immune suppressant drug that people having organ transplants and these sorts of things, that comes from a cordyceps fungus, that drug, and a number of other drugs, both in use as well as in the pipeline, are coming from different types of cordyceps. But also people are just putting cordyceps in all sorts of foods, coffee and chocolate and everything, because of the purported medicinal properties of cordyceps based on people in Asia that have long harvested this fungus and used it for all sorts of traditional Chinese medicine. But it's exploded to the point that now all of a sudden everyone's heard of zombie fungi and stuff like that. Those are all types of cordyceps and cordyceps-like fungi, and it's just incredible. I mean, again, when I was a student, there was two species and no one had ever heard of them, because how would you have heard of it? Now all of a sudden it's like the coolest mushroom. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's lots of research. It's still on the uptick, on the vast uptick.
Yeah, it is interesting to think that if you're interested in mushrooms, you don't have to have an ecology background. You could also go into medicine or and I think some mushrooms or people like creating molds out of mushrooms.
Yeah, there's so many different aspects. And to be honest, when I was a college professor and advising students, like wanting to go, which program to go into, what to study, uh, graduate degrees, what did you need to qualify and prepare for graduate degrees? To be honest, to do anything in biology anymore, you actually don't need any biology work at all. You need a lot of chemistry and a lot of math to do these sorts of things. I find it very helpful if you're curious and want to learn biology and learn about ecology and all of these sorts of things. But sadly, you don't really have to study those things anymore. There's the type of science that's being done in biology nowadays doesn't really rely too much on biology so much as chemistry and some other things. So, unfortunately.
So be well versed in all subject areas.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if if let's say you wanted to study cordyceps ecology or cordyceps taxonomy, and you wanted to do like DNA sequence analysis or whatever with cordyceps specifically, um, if you got all of the math and chemistry and all of that sort of stuff behind you, you could learn everything you need to know about cordyceps ecology in a single class, more or less. So unfortunately, it's because I was more traditionally trained to have, lots and lots of math and chemistry, but um, I was always really excited by invertebrate zoology classes and ecology classes and all that sort of stuff. But that's not really how biology is done so much anymore.
All right, well, thank you so much, Britt, and thank you everyone who attended this live. Britt's information is going to be in the description of this YouTube video. And once again, thank you for a great presentation.
Thanks very much. It was fun.